Which speaker sounds more intelligent? Be honest. Because whatever you just chose, I probably would have chosen the same. And that's exactly the problem. Listen to these two voices.
Pack up your things. You're fired. Pack up your things. You're fired.
Standard British.
Pack up your things. You're fired.
South African.
Pack up your things. You're fired.
Same sentence, same person, only the accent changed. What you just experienced is not just a trick, it's based on a real study in sociolinguistics. It's called the matched guise experiment. The matched guise experiment was first developed by Wallace Lambert in the 1960s. In the original study, participants listened to recordings of bilingual speakers reading the same passage in different accents or languages. Then they were asked to evaluate the speaker on traits like intelligence, friendliness, and reliability. What researchers found was surprisingly consistent. Even though the speaker was the same person, people rated them differently depending on how they sounded. Certain accents were associated with higher intelligence or competence. Others were judged less favorably, not because of what was said, but because of how it sounded. So, what this experiment shows is something a bit uncomfortable. When we think we are evaluating language, we are often actually evaluating the person behind it. And what makes this more interesting is that this isn't something people do consciously. Most participants weren't trying to be unfair. They were simply reacting to what felt familiar, standard, or correct. In this series, I've been talking about accents, how they are formed, how they are taught, and how they are perceived. But recently, I started to feel like something was off. When I listened back to my own episodes, they sounded too clean, too put together, like I was explaining something but not really saying anything. I kept talking about how we shouldn't judge accents, but the way I said it started to feel like a cliche, and I don't really know how to fix that, because I still want to say something meaningful, but I'm not even sure if it's coming from me anymore, and I'm not showing my face either. So sometimes I wonder, am I actually expressing something, or just generating something that sounds right? And maybe this isn't separate from what I've been talking about. Because just like accents, voices carry assumptions, even when they're artificial. If we look at how English is actually used today, the situation becomes more complicated. There are around 1.5 billion English speakers in the world. Out of those, only about 400 million are native speakers. That means roughly 70 to 75% of people using English every day are non-native speakers. In other words, most English conversations today are happening between people who all have some kind of accent. English is no longer limited to English-speaking countries. It has become a shared language across different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. But even with that reality, the idea of a correct accent still exists. Thinking about this made me reflect on my own experience. I've often been told that my English doesn't sound strongly Japanese, and I used to take that as a good thing, like it meant my English was better. But at the same time, I noticed something uncomfortable. I sometimes reacted differently to people who had a strong Japanese accent. Even when they were clearly communicating, something about the way they sounded made me feel like their English was less natural. And I didn't really have a reason for that. It wasn't logical. It was just what I was used to, what I had learned to recognize as normal. So even though I understood that accent doesn't define ability, I still had to face the fact that I had internalized a hierarchy of accents. In Japan, English is often taught with a strong focus on American pronunciation. Students are trained to see that as the model they should aim for. So, over time, people start to associate sounding American with being fluent or competent. But that assumption doesn't always match how communication actually works. For example, some features of Japanese pronunciation are actually closer to British English than American English. Japanese also uses a lot of loanwords from Western languages, and they make up nearly 10% of the vocabulary. Many of those reflect older British pronunciations, like how we say
トマト、
instead of tomato. So, depending on the listener, Japanese accented English might actually be easier to understand than expected, especially for people who are more familiar with British pronunciation. So, what counts as easy to understand is not fixed. It depends on who is listening, what they are used to, and how the speech is delivered. If we go back to the experiment, it helps explain why this happens. It's not just about preference. It reflects deeper social attitudes about language, status, and identity. An accent is never just a way of pronouncing words. It carries assumptions about where someone is from, how educated they are, and how they fit into a social structure. So what happens next? If most English users are non-native speakers, and if communication is happening across different accents all the time, then the idea of one correct way of speaking becomes less useful. Instead, English is moving toward a model where variation is normal. People adjust to each other. They negotiate meaning. They rely on clarity rather than imitation. So maybe the question is no longer, how do I sound like a native speaker? But something else. How do we listen? How do we interpret what we hear? And how much of what we hear is actually about the person, not the language? This episode series comes to an end for now. But in the next month, I'm planning to post a podcast series about dying languages. I promise that it will be just as interesting or maybe even more. So stay tuned and don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for listening.